Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please take a seat. Before I get going, I had to do some Webex instructions per House and admin. Here we go. Members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Those members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulty, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television/internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated a committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. Got it all. Good morning. I call to order this first hearing of the Intelligence and Special Operations Subcommittee on Disinformation in the Gray Zone, Opportunities, Limitations, and Challenges. We're seeing unprecedented threats to our democracy and a disturbing rise of authoritarian actors. Anti-democratic forces have capitalized on the rapidly evolving information environment to spread disinformation and misinformation and exploit fissures in our society. The only way to reverse these trends is through a whole-of-society approach, working with partners and allies who share our values. After 2 decades of war, fighting terrorists in Afghanistan, Iraq, and also around the Middle East and Africa, we have discovered an even greater threat inside the wire. Gone are the days when we could solely rely on the armed forces to fight our wars beyond our borders. The threats and attacks are now here, on American soil and at home. The 2018 National Defense Strategy stated that the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. Our adversaries' use of information technology has proven that out. They craft and feed misinformation to our news outlets and social media about the safety of vaccines, for example, the efficacy of our institutions, and the depth of our differences. And then they weaponize our own reactions to that misinformation. So we have a problem. So much so that last year, 9 combatant commanders co-signed a letter to the Director of National Intelligence requesting immediate help to combat the pervasive and damaging influence by China and Russia. I want to hear what we're doing to help our commanders. How are we making sure that information about the malign activities of Russia and China is not overclassified? And how are you synchronizing with the State Department and with partners and allies to combat these threats? Information operations is one way that the United States can protect itself and its partners against dis- and misinformation efforts by China and Russia. But we should aspire for cohesion and breadth. We must develop a comprehensive influence strategy to truly protect our borders, our allies, and our interests. In that context, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the Department's efforts to support and build a whole government construct. I want to introduce the 3 witnesses who tell us a little about that. Mr. Christopher Mayer, Acting Assistant Director of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. Mr. Neil Tipton, Director of Defense Intelligence Collections and Special Programs. And Mr. James Sullivan, Defense Intelligence Officer. Following this discussion, we'll continue a closed classified session. I understand that Ranking Member Kelly is on his way to from the airport, so we will get started with our opening statements from our witnesses, and once we're done with our witness statements, we will swing back to Ranking Member Kelly for his opening statement. And with that, let's start with Mr. Mayer. Thank you.
Chairman, we're actually going to start with an intel brief, if that's okay, and quickly then shift from there.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members, good morning. My name is Jim Sullivan, the Defense Intelligence Officer for Cyber. Thank you for the invitation to come down here. I'll provide you some background.
Mr. Sullivan, please put the mic closer to your mouth. Thank you.
Want the mask off as well?
Either or. No, just put the mask on. Just put the mic closer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I'm here to provide a threat landscape against of our 2 main rivals, Russia and China, in the information sphere. I'll cover more specifics in the closed session. I'll begin with Russia. Russia sees the information sphere as a key domain for modern military conflict. Russia has prioritized the development of forces and means for information confrontation in a holistic concept for ensuring information superiority since at least the 1920s. Russia wages this struggle for information dominance during peacetime and armed conflict with equal intensity, using combined electronic and kinetic means and methods through information technical, information psychological, and active measures. The Russian government claims NATO countries led by the United States have created a powerful information operations system and are expanding and improving it. Russia sees the information domain differently than the United States and its allies and partners. Russian publications and actions indicate its government maintains a holistic concept of information confrontation. Specifically, information confrontation seeks to dominate the information domain through a combination of what it defines as information technical effects or means which seek to manipulate networks, computer, and data, and information psychological effects, all intended to target people or a population to influence behavior or opinions. We are increasingly seeing the integrated use of cyber-enabled psychological actions, distributed denial of service attacks, propaganda disseminated through social media and bots, strategic deception and disinformation, and electromagnetic warfare to achieve strategic goals. China seeks to influence domestic, foreign, and multilateral political establishments and public opinion to accept China's narratives and to remove obstacles that prevent China from attaining its goals, including the sustainment of the Communist Party regime. The People's Liberation Army has developed the concept of three warfares, which is to say public opinion, legal, and psychological warfare as key components of its psychological cognitive warfare efforts. These efforts are designed to demoralize adversaries and to influence foreign and domestic public opinion. Similar to Russia, China also takes a broad approach to include the establishment of cultural centers, taking control of Chinese language print media, and the employment of cyber techniques. China views the cyber domain in particular as an ideal platform for strategic influence and deception and disinformation operations. The PLA likely seeks to use digital influence activities to support its overall three warfares concept and to undermine an adversary's social cohesion, economy, morale, and governance. These operations are conducted with intensity in peacetime, and we anticipate they would be conducted with increased intensity during armed conflict. The PLA goals for social media influence activities fall into three broad categories: to promote a narrative favorable to China, undermine adversary resolve and social cohesion, and shape foreign governments' policy in favor of China's core interests. Sir, that concludes my opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. And Mr. Mayor?
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Kelly, and distinguished committee members, it is an honor to be with you here today. As was already stated, I am Chris Mayer. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict. In this capacity, I serve as the Principal Civilian Advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict matters, including the employment of Special Operations Forces. On behalf of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, I also provide oversight for information operations. Building on the brief laydown on the threat you received just now from the Defense Intelligence Agency, I'm here with my colleagues from the Department of Defense to discuss our approach to adversary disinformation in the gray zone and the department's efforts to gain and maintain the operational advantage in this evolving threat environment. Adversary use of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda poses one of today's greatest challenges to the United States, not just to the Department of Defense. Russia and China, as well as non-state actors, understand that in today's information environment, they have real-time access to a global audience that with first-mover advantage, and by flooding the information environment with deliberately and manipulated information, that is, mostly truthful with carefully crafted deceptive elements, these actors can gain leverage to threaten our interests. Although we are here today to discuss various DoD efforts, we recognize that we do not have a monopoly on U.S. government capabilities to combat disinformation, nor should we. The Department of Defense is one of a whole-of-government approach to this challenge, and other civilian departments and agencies have critical roles and responsibilities which demand close interagency coordination and clear authorities. Coordinated interagency effects can complement the efforts of each department and agency to defend the nation against disinformation and to reach and engage global audiences. As we strive to leverage DoD's information operation capabilities in competition with malign actors, we must first acknowledge, as reiterated in the recently published Interim National Security Strategic Guidance, that we will actively support elevating diplomacy as our tool of first resort. DoD directly supports the Department of State's public diplomacy teams and the Global Engagement Center and complements the activities of the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Within DoD, we organize our efforts to combat disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda in 4 broad lines of effort, all supported by a foundation of intelligence support, interagency collaboration, and partnerships. These 4 areas are countering propaganda by adversaries, force protection, countering disinformation and strategic deception abroad by adversaries, and deterring and disrupting adversarial malign influence capabilities. I'll briefly touch on each one of these efforts. Countering propaganda. Propaganda, especially with a capable sponsor spreading it to susceptible audiences, can often drown out truthful information and create barriers to fact-based messaging. Public affairs is the lead within DoD for countering propaganda that affect U.S. military objectives. Public affairs also leads the department's efforts to inform domestic and foreign audiences of adversaries' attempts to manipulate behavior in this domain. Other DoD capabilities support public affairs efforts to lead proactively with truthful, verifiable, fact-based messaging. DoD efforts to engage foreign audiences overseas support the Department of State's lead to inform foreign audiences. Next, force protection. Our soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, guardians, civilians, and their family are part of the American public directly targeted by malign actors, disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. DoD views this as a critical force protection issue. The military services are proactive in building resilience against these threats, enabling the force to recognize deceptive information tactics by adversaries' information operation. Developing digital literacy and employing critical thinking skills are a few key initiatives within the force protection line of effort. Third, countering disinformation abroad. At DoD, we also draw upon operational and informational capabilities such as military information support operations, often better known by its acronym MISO, to generate narratives to compete against disinformation efforts directed at foreign audiences. These DoD capabilities can amplify and complement existing themes and messages to inform audiences that cannot be reached through traditional communications channels. To counter disinformation abroad, at DoD we pursue a comprehensive and deliberate approach, working in close consultation again with state to connect with audiences globally in real time and to build communications that foreign audiences trust. Knowledge and trust by foreign audiences will reduce and even suppress the impact of malign influence activities. And then finally, deterring and disrupting adversarial malign influence capabilities. Perhaps DoD's greatest strength lies in our ability to align narratives with actions in the domains of land, sea, air, cyber, and space, and information-related capabilities against key weaknesses in the adversary's information environment. Further, as we continue to seek to empower and work through partners, DoD draws on our knowledge, skills, and infrastructure to enable allies, partners, proxies, and surrogates to compete with malign actors, often near-peer competitors in the information environment, and for the benefit of their own populations as well as our own. Our partners are force multipliers in deterring and disrupting adversarial disinformation. Through our ability to match words with deeds, we complement the efforts of our diplomats to deter malign behaviors, incentivize cooperation, and at times compel action. DoD's ongoing efforts to defend forward, to actively detect, assess, and when directed, disrupt adversaries' disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda bolsters our actions in the information environment. My colleague Neil Tipton, Director of Defense Information, will speak in just a moment about intelligence support to these efforts. To foreshadow from policy and operational perspectives, intelligence support is essential to the whole of government partnerships that are key to our collective U.S. government success against adversary disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. And to reinforce once again, our international allies and partners are essential in reinforcing our collective efforts, often by contributing unique capabilities to countering adversaries' malign efforts. We are most effective when bolstered by their perspectives and their integration into our planning and execution. In sum, the department continues to invest in our capabilities and capacities so that we are best positioned to mitigate and defeat the disinformation efforts of our adversaries. We continuously aim to improve our speed, agility, efficiency, and effectiveness, and most importantly, teamwork across the U.S. government and internationally. We appreciate this subcommittee's attention to this critically important issue and your ongoing support to the department's efforts in this information domain. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I will now turn it over to my colleague Neil Tipton, who will address how intelligence supports these efforts. After that, we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Tipton?
Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Kelly, and distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So as previously mentioned, I'm Neil Tipton, Director for Defense Intelligence for Collection and Special Programs in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intel and Security. Today, I'll speak to you about the intel support needed to ensure that the department maintains the upper hand against the challenge of disinformation in the gray zone. I'll focus my remarks today really on 4 key areas where we are prioritizing intel support to the various efforts we're discussing: partnerships in intel support, intelligence support to irregular warfare, intelligence support to operations in the information environment, and support to the combatant commands, which gets at Chairman Gallego's comments about the colloquially known 36-star memo. I'll start with partnerships and intelligence support. So underpinning all these efforts is a strong commitment to a whole-of-government partnership and decision cycle that constantly assesses the effects of misinformation and propaganda and seeks to attribute these efforts to the responsible parties. This requires active cooperation across the responsible departments and agencies, as well as direct support from the intelligence community. The DoD leverages its information capabilities to gain and maintain the information advantage and integrates with the tools of other departments as part of a broader and more comprehensive approach. Our international allies and partners—
Mr. Tipton, can you slow down a little?
Absolutely.
I don't have you on the clock, so you're good to go.
Okay.
Thank you.
I can do that. Thank you.
It may be that I'm just a slow learner more than
Okay.
anything else.
Our international allies and partners also bring reinforcing and often unique capabilities in our endeavors to counter adversaries' malign efforts, and their capabilities will be integrated into our planning efforts as well. The recently signed Defense Intelligence Strategy prioritizes China and Russia. The strategy calls out a specific action to prioritize intelligence support to strategic competition and influence efforts. The Defense Intelligence Enterprise will help advance U.S. influence and counter-coercive campaigns via robust and focused intelligence support to sensitive and special activities, influence, deception, and more broadly speaking, operations in the information environment. We would like to highlight for the committee 3 specific examples of ongoing actions that OUSDINS is supporting through our role within DoD and our partnership with the broader intelligence community. So those are, as mentioned, intel support to irregular warfare, intelligence support to operations in the information environment, and the intelligence dissemination to support combatant command messaging and counter activities. So intel support to irregular warfare. In support of the Irregular Warfare Annex to the 2018 NDS, USDINS, in partnership with the Joint Staff J2, is supporting specific lines of effort to enable DoD to improve understanding in what we call the multi-domain environment. The several lines of efforts focus on identifying indications and warnings, integrating collection, leveraging big data, and reinforcing intelligence sharing best practices, and assessing all the policies and processes that support these efforts. Intelligence support to operations in the information environment. As I'm sure you're aware, my colleague, Mr. Mayor, has oversight for operations in the information environment. We've established as part of that a Defense Intelligence Support to Operations in the Information Environment Working Group that has got a variety of activities underway to increase and enhance that support, one of which is a new effort working with ODNI to focus the national intelligence community collection efforts on assisting us in the conduct of influence-related activities against key adversaries. That work is still ongoing. Also, that group is focused on drafting and staffing a new DoD instruction for intelligence support to operations in the information environment. That would codify recommendations that came out of a 2019 JROC memo, so the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, that provided some specific recommendations to the department on how we enhance these activities. Amongst other things, it will direct the DIA to prioritize resources for intelligence support to OIE in the next published consolidated intelligence guidance, and will help us shape and work, again, as I mentioned, with the DNI and the National Intelligence Focusing Groups to drive some of these key concepts into the broader prioritization framework that the DNI manages for the IC. And finally, I'll talk about combatant command support. Another line of effort, as you had mentioned, for which we're providing intelligence support to OIE has been through the joint DoD Director of National Intelligence response to the intel demands from the combatant commands. As you mentioned, in January of 2020, 9 combatant commanders signed that memo out. We referred to it as the 36-star memo, which asked for increased support from the IC for messaging and countering disinformation operations as part of a great power competition. In response, we partnered in an ongoing effort to streamline processes for downgrading, declassifying, and disclosing intelligence in support of operations in the information environment. We look to complete the current efforts in response to that memo by September of this year, while continuing follow-on initiatives to increase the use of open source intelligence and to determine policy and resourcing strategies to provide the most effective intel support to OIE going forward. And then finally, we're working across the department to improve our training of intelligence personnel in this space and to optimize our tradecraft as appropriate to support operations in the information environment. So the DIE will continue to support these efforts and ensure the department is postured for success in this area. We appreciate your attention to this very important matter. This concludes my remarks, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shipton. Member Kelly for opening statements.
I apologize to you guys for being late. I literally came straight off a plane straight here. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being patient. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your opening remarks and your leadership in organizing this morning's important hearing. Today we will hear from 3 professionals in our Intelligence and Special Operations Committees for both an unclassified and classified conversation about the spread of disinformation from our adversaries. To highlight just how seriously we take this disinformation, Chairman Gallego has chosen it as the subject of the first official hearing of the new Intelligence and Special Operations Subcommittee. The subcommittee was recently briefed on the threatening activities of China. Just last week, during a full committee hearing, we heard from Admiral Phil Davidson, Commander Indo-PACOM. He described ways the Communist Party or China uses a whole-of-government approach to exert control over the regions. One of the ways China conducts this external aggression and coercion is via the perverse spread of disinformation. This is most clearly seen in China's information campaigns around the coronavirus pandemic. The spread of malign information has sought to spread panic and distrust within the U.S. and even alleged that the United States Army was responsible for bringing the virus to China. China is not alone in these efforts. State-backed accounts in Russia and Iran also constructed manipulative narratives about our vaccine efforts. In fact, Russia has repeatedly used the gray zone to spread disinformation. An article in the Wall Street Journal from March 7th describes activities of Russia's intelligence enterprise across multiple state-backed online news sites. The article outlines specific actions taken to spread misleading and false narratives to discredit the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine. The use of disinformation is not just linked to current pandemic, however. Our adversaries have long used this gray zone to operate, push false narratives, and undermine the national security interests of the United States. A memo signed last year by 9 combatant commanders drives home just how important this issue is. Recognizing the need for increased support from the intelligence community to combat this threat, they note malicious efforts by Russia and China across the information domain to seed discontent, weaken trust, and undermine alliances. The threat is real and growing. I'm interested to hear our witnesses' views on how to best train and equip our intelligence professionals to counter this threat. I want to thank our witnesses in advance for their time today. I look forward to continuing work with our Intel and Special Operations professionals during the 117th Congress. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kelly. We'll now go to questions, and we'll, again, for our members, we will be limiting it to 5 minutes, and when you are recognized, please make sure to unmute your microphone, and we will begin with me. Countering misinformation, while an important DoD function, also involves the State Department and Intel Committee. How will ASD Solik and the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence work across the defense and intelligence communities to ensure coordination and effort in this space? Start with you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I think in the first instance, it's important for us to clearly articulate to our intelligence community colleagues the requirements. And there is a wide definition of what we do in the information operations space, and there's a limited number of intelligence resources. So it's really incumbent on us on the policy side, especially from the oversight perspective, to make sure that we're communicating clearly what those priorities are for intelligence support. Everybody needs intelligence in this day and age to do everything. And so I think it's incumbent on us to really be clear in working with the intelligence community beyond just the Department of Defense, what those requirements are. Imagine my colleague would be able to speak to the intelligence requirements piece and how he manages those.
So, Chairman, just a couple of thoughts. One is nothing we do is done in a vacuum, and USDI ensures we work in a very tight partnership with ODNI.
Mr. Tipton, please bring the mic closer to you.
Sorry. So I'd comment first by saying that nothing we do is executed in a vacuum. We work very closely with the Office of the DNI on all these kinds of activities, and this is a specific case where we're partnered very tightly with them as we respond to the 36-star memo and other kinds of activities that are necessary to operate in the information environment. The same goes with our allies. We recognize that we have to operate as part of a greater whole, and we're very tightly lashed up, especially with our closest allies, as we develop new products, reshape the priorities, develop all the supporting processes and enabling activities that we have to design and implement in order to reshape the outputs of the Intel enterprise, which for 20 years has been focused on other problem sets, to how do we refocus on this problem set and support customers like ASD Mayor and other operators in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the necessity of activities conducted by the department to mitigate or curtail nefarious actions by our adversaries intended to undermine and counter the strength of our military. However, information operations are one small part of what should be a larger whole-government approach to combat malicious Russian or Chinese behavior. Some of our allies and partners already do this, but they're much smaller than us, and their problems and opportunities are different from ours. Given the proliferation of disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda, would it be appropriate to call for a whole-government influence campaign and strategy to ensure nested and synchronized efforts to the benefit of our national security objectives? And to follow up with that, well, Mr. Mayor, if you wanted to start with that.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think it is, and I think we endeavor to do so in a number of focused efforts. Obviously, China and Russia use, and Iran and other non-state actors use this technique across a whole range of different issues, so we need to be precise as we leverage those interagency efforts and with our partners.
And so we recognize that we need to do it, but trying to bring together different departments, different agencies with different goals, different missions to be focused requires at least someone to be the coordinator of that. Who is coordinating that at this point?
Mr. Chairman, we would look to the National Security Council staff to lead those interagency efforts, but Department of Defense, state already organically work together on a number of these, but the real quarterback in this system of the interagency is going to be the NSC staff, sir.
Yep. Mr. Mayor, what role does the ASD SOLIC play in information operations, specifically the interplay of big DoD, SOCOM, and the interagency?
Mr. Chairman, I'd answer your question in two ways. We first, as has been directed by 922 and in the NDAA from 2017, reinforces the role that ASD SOLIC plays as a service secretary-like or administrative chain of command. So we have responsibility, civilian oversight for ensuring the force is equipped to do these operations, SOCOM, but also the components, use of SOC, Navy SEALs, Air Force Special Operations Command, a whole series of others. And then on the policy side of things, we are the direct support to the Undersecretary for Policy for integrating information operations and these types of disciplines into the policy development process for the Department of Defense.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Representative Kelly?
Mr. Chairman, I yield to Mr. Bacon, who's prepared to move forward with questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your expertise. I sure appreciate it. One of the things that I've noted that our adversaries often use our partisan political seams for disinformation, which makes it harder for us to counter. How do we overcome that when, say, Russia in 2016 uses disinformation in a way that's makes it hard in a partisan environment to counter. I'd be curious for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, is that a deep fake that we just saw with the two Bacons of the?
Not sure, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Okay, Mr. Bacon, sorry.
Could you hear me? All right, I asked the question.
So I would just take that broadly and then defer to the Intel community on the specifics of this, but I think it's a well-recognized technique that these malign actors are using, and I think some of this is, again, some of the points I made in building resilience and ensuring that what is coming out, at least from U.S. government information sources, whether it's public affairs or others, is truthful information. As to how we best counter adversaries exploiting that, I'll defer to my intelligence colleague for how they're doing that.
Yeah, Mr. Bacon, Jim Sullivan from DIA. So it really does begin with making sure that we are working across the spectrum of DIA, NGA, NSA, CIA, FBI, and others, and enhancing our own capability inside the defense intelligence enterprise. The number one, understand who the cyber actors are, where the, what publications, what social media platforms are they using, what is their strategy, doctrine, and intent at getting to the American public, and what specifically is it that they're targeting. Once we have the bubble on that, then we can work with others inside the combatant command, other intel agencies, and be better equipped to counteract that.
One thing that I saw in France, I thought they did a good job just saying right up front, candidly, this is what Russia is doing, and they're trying to play on partisan divides. And I just think we have to be more candid with our voters and with our citizens when this happens. One other question for you before I yield. DoD's 2020 China Military Power Report identified how China uses its so-called 50-cent army to, among other things, try to influence public opinion towards the pro-China perspectives. It noted how in 2019, Facebook and Twitter had deleted some accounts spreading disinformation regarding the protests in Hong Kong. So over the past year, have social media companies been more effective at reducing the spread of disinformation, especially from China and Russia? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that, Mr. Bacon. So I think in the last several years, social media and also too, commercial vendors have operated quite prolifically in this space and have gotten very, very capable both in determining, attributing where this activity is coming from, and then being able to use algorithms in order to delete accounts. Now, I can't speak to what they're doing for China at this moment, but the trend is I think, moving in a positive direction. When you take that in combination with what we're doing in open source, I think we're getting a better handle on, at least false narratives, again, identification of the media platforms that they're using. And I think as time goes on, we're better postured to do that. I think 2 years ago, I think it was quite difficult to be able to understand what was a false account. But the tradecraft has gotten much better. Being able to identify it has gotten much better. And I have every expectation that in the future, that's only going to improve.
I'll just close with two comments. First, we have a long history in our country of being successful in this area. Well, World War II, multiple examples where we can overcome. So we have it within our ability to win in this spectrum. And I'll just close by saying thank you to each of you for serving and defending our country. And I appreciate what you do every day. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Bacon. Thank you, Member Kelly. I now recognize Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mayor, given what we've heard today, with regards to SOCOM, does it, this is sort of a loaded question, but does it imply a need for changing either who we recruit, the skills they have, the skills we develop in SOCOM, and the structure of the teams within SOCOM in order to address these particular challenges? Have you thought through that, and can you give us some idea what you're thinking?
Yes, thanks, Congressman Larson. That's, I think, a very important question, and I have the benefit in the role I play to support the Secretary of Defense, who has made diversity one of his #1 challenges. I had the benefit of sitting in a conversation he had with General Clark the SOCOM commander, and he made that abundantly clear that diversity is an operational imperative. It has the benefits that you articulated in your question of being able to bring different perspectives, different ways of communicating, knowledge of culture, things that if everybody looks the same, if everybody thinks the same, is going to render us not particularly effective in these challenging environments. And we're evolving, I think, as a country and a force from a heavy focus on the counter VEO, violent extremist organizations, to a much more diverse threat environment where information is one of the tools they're using. And we've got to be able to play their game against them and beat them in some respects on their own playing field. That means ability to speak languages, ability to draw on cultural innuendos that aren't necessarily obvious to those that may have been trained for other purposes.
So within SOCOM, do you think they're evolving fast enough to support this?
I think, sir, that they would say they're not evolving fast enough. And as you know, in training special operations forces, it really requires recruitment and training far down the line, very early in the process. And that is something that all the components, whether it's the SEALs, the Air Force Special Operations components, or the Army components, Marine Corps, are looking at how they get farther downstream in their recruiting in order to do what you're articulating.
As acting ASD SOLIC, do you think you have enough authority, and would you have enough authority as a permanent confirmation to push that along?
At this point, I think I do, sir, but a lot of this is going to be just persistent keeping on this. This is a priority that is going to take, unfortunately, a long time to actually see fruition, and we're going to have to stay on this. It's a strong partnership, I think, with SOCOM, and they recognize this need and have prioritized it as well. That's the best arrangement, I think, regardless of bureaucratic standing, to get to a success.
And on bureaucratic standing, I understand that SecDef, Secretary of Defense, is reviewing the changes that former Secretary of Defense Miller put in place about the role of ASD SOLIC. Do you have any insight to where that is now? My personal view is that regardless of the outcome, we need to have a stronger civilian oversight over SOCOM forces.
Yeah, Congressman, thank you for that statement. It is a decision that's before the Secretary of Defense now. I think the options are fairly obvious. They are, do we keep it the way it is with SOLIC separate from all the other entities in the department, or do we integrate it into policy for its policy pieces? But I don't think there's been any options discussed in which ASD SOLIC does not, and I reiterate that, does not continue to report to the Secretary of Defense as a principal staff assistant for that administrative piece of oversight and civilian oversight of Special Operations Command, sir.
Yeah, thanks. I just don't want any confusion about the letter that was sent a few weeks ago from members of this subcommittee and others about the intent of the letter. Back to sort of the broader, I've got 56 seconds left. Back to the broader issue of intelligence and intelligence sharing. I'm going to have to get caught up a little bit more on all the letters. I mean, I understand all the lettered agencies you talked about, but and perhaps you can think about this for the classified. If you think there are any gaps in how that information gets communicated within the DoD and between agencies, so that it can be most effectively used. I don't know if there's something you can say about that now, Mr. Tipton. You look like you're eager to answer that question.
Yeah, Congressman, I'll just comment that we're rebuilding muscle memory that we haven't exercised really since the Cold War as we operate in this kind of information domain. And so clearly there are gaps in how we do that, and we are working through that. We can talk a little bit more about that in the closed session.
I look forward to it. That's fine, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Larson. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't have a whole lot. I will say that I was on one of our military installations the other day, and speaking about the kind of the width and the depth of the anger that I see out there, and one of the generals suggested to me that they were seeing it in their ranks too, and that I should watch the documentary Social Dilemma and how people are able to use information against us. And so just a suggestion for the committee, and maybe looking for a comment from the people that are presenting, is are we discussing with our soldiers the potential for the use of this information, misinformation through social media to create bias in the ranks or dissent in the ranks of the military? Do you know if we're actually having discussions with our troops on that?
Mr. Scott, I can answer that question. So absolutely, and one of the main pillars that I mentioned in my remarks and that I can go into a little bit more depth on is the force protection concerns that associated with intentional misinformation and disinformation through social media. A critical component of what Secretary of Defense Austin is looking at too is extremism, and a key component of these stand downs that we're all involved in, not just the uniform side, but the civilian side, is looking at the influences from the outside that do contribute to extremism, and as one of your colleagues says, attempts to divide not only the forces, but us as citizens. And I think we look at this through the lens of every soldier is both a citizen and a member of the armed forces, and having to look at both those perspectives is a critical piece as they're looking at social media, and we look to as much as possible make them resilient against what we know are concerted efforts to attempt to divide, in some cases drive them to extremism, certainly.
Well, I would finish with this. One is, I think it's been very effective what they're doing, unfortunately, and as this current generation comes out of high school and college, they're the first generation where basically everything they've done has been on the internet, and I think we need to expand beyond the scope of the military and as fast as we can, and advising the American citizens, what is happening with the ability of outside influences who do not like our country to influence, our attitudes towards each other in this country, and how damaging it is to us. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield.
Thank you, Representative Scott. Representative Keating. Representative Keating. Representative Keating, put down the Danish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard my name. I just want to thank the witnesses. This is an important issue, and I'm just pleased that, just more commentary. I'm pleased that the new Secretary of Defense is taking these issues as seriously as he is, and we all have to work. And I just want to continue to work, particularly in the other committee I'm on, where we're dealing with some of the malign actors in this field with Russia and some of their activities. So that's all I had to say as a comment going forward, but I thank you. And thank you for having this as your first full hearing, Mr. Chairman. I think it's an important one. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Keating. We have Representative Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your time this morning. This is a very critical topic. I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Mayor. In your testimony, you referenced ongoing efforts to detect, assess, and then, when directed, disrupt adversaries, disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. I'm just curious, just for my own edification, what is the trip line for when that takes place? Who has the authority to direct that action? And then what would a response look like to that misinformation or disinformation?
Yes, sir. So this is going to be it depends answer a little bit here. And in an open forum, what I would say is that a key element of being flexible in the information operations space is ensuring that authorities are delegated down to the appropriate level with the appropriate risk built into that. And so I think if you're talking about activities that on one extreme could be kinetic in nature, and that is not outside the realm, those are going to be the purview, of course, of the Secretary of Defense or delegated down. If you're talking about the ability to go out and push back on a narrative, in many respects, that's at lower levels within public affairs or even within the military information support operation, generally in support to State Department, public diplomacy and public affairs. So it's going to depend in many respects on what the action envisioned is and how that is viewed from a risk perspective. But the success here is predicated on delegating to the lowest level possible, sir.
Okay, I appreciate that. And that sort of feeds into my next question with regard to an overall strategy for how we would approach this. In Section 1239 of the NDAA for fiscal year 2020, it called for development of a comprehensive strategy to counter the threat of malign influence by PRC in Russia. And I think that was due within 6 months, which would have been probably June or so of 2020. Can you tell us where that stands, elaborate on the status of that effort?
Congressman, I'm going to have to take that as a request for to follow up. I don't know exactly where that is.
Okay. All right. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Excellent. Representative Sherrill. Okay, we'll come back to Representative Sherrill. In the meantime, well, let's see. Kelly, do you have anybody? No? Okay. We'll move on to Representative Panetta.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. And of course, thank you to all the witnesses for your service, your preparation, your testimony especially. Thank you very much. I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the 1st Special Forces down at Fort Bragg recently announced an information warfare center just for these types of operations. Can you, and then that I guess their main goal is to deliver an influence artillery round, quote unquote. Can you give me a little information about the center? Can you give me a little information about what that influence artillery round would look like?
So, sir, I'm going to have to take that for further follow-up to give you an exact answer, but I think it's indicative of what we're trying to do across the force, which is really elevate this issue to a point where I wouldn't want to articulate or even speculate on what they mean by an information artillery round, but I think that speaks to the idea that information is a part of our warfighting concept, and therefore we bring this into the same series of options we would bring kinetic or other capabilities that might be more traditional, sir.
Understood. Understood. On that note, do you think, or do you know, or can you surmise if there are plans for other similar types of centers in the future for not just special operations, but other parts of our military?
Yes, sir. I think not only do we envision those, we've got a number of these that are up and operating. The Joint MISO Center down at Special Operations Command is actually an outgrowth of something that Central Command developed, and the realization was we need to be doing this globally. So that's one that I know this committee has in the past looked into, and we continue to be supportive of it in concept. That is not just because it's at SOCOM isn't a special operations thing, that's all the combatant commands. And so that brings, we hope, an economy of scale to those efforts.
Great, thank you. So kind of going from looking inward to looking outward, how do you think, Russia obviously is, kind of set the pace on this and China's followed. How do you think they're going to evolve with their hybrid warfare going forward and using these types of information, disinformation warfare?
Yeah, Congressman, I'll take that one from DIA. So it's been said in the past that in the information sphere that Russia introduces bad weather, whereas China is changing the climate. I would say that that is an accurate statement, except to your point, it's reversed. I think it is Russia that's changing the climate, and I think it is China that's introducing bad weather. To further complicate it, though, China will grow into that role. China will use technology. China will use machine learning and AI faster than the Russians will do it. Russia is, without question, ahead because they're a lot more prolific and they're a lot more destructive, and they have a slightly different intent, which is to, they're much more aggressive in terms of trying to undermine U.S. democracy and enhance to degrade social cohesion in the United States. China is not necessarily up to that. But this information, to answer your question broadly, the threat in the information domain is here to stay because it really comes down to conventional military overmatch, of which neither country has that against the United States. Cyber is a great equalizer in that nobody is 100% mature in this domain, and information dominance is effective, it is cheap, and it is quick.
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate that. And in looking at, is there one theater in particular that each of those near peers are focusing on? Are they sticking to their areas of influence, or are you seeing that in other areas, Africa or so forth?
So it all depends. It all depends on the actor. Both are global. So Russia has a much more massive global presence. They're very much entrenched in Africa, very much so in Eastern Europe. They still try to look at really sort of sowing discord in areas in Europe in which we have a forward presence. China, of course, is very interested in ASEAN. It is in the South Pacific. But it too also has a global narrative as well in terms of trying to really present the Chinese Communist Party as an alternative to the United States and Western democracies. I'll get more into that in the closed session, but Mr. Mayor's point, it depends. It really depends on the objective, and it depends on the actor.
Understood. And then obviously, this may be something in a closed session, but looking at are either our friends or those who are not so friendly to us. Are you seeing other nations develop into this area with a little more skill that you wouldn't think coming from them? I mean, either allies, friends, or foes. Which ones are we watching when it comes to this type of misinformation and gray zone warfare?
So everybody,
besides our near peers.
Yeah, everybody plays in this sphere to some degree, including us. I don't see an enormous threat from any of our allies or anybody who I would not consider to be, China and Russia. Certainly the DPRK and the Iranians also play in this. And if I had to stratify it, again, I would put Russia as number 1, China is number 2, Iran is number 3, DPRK is number 4.
Understood. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you again to everybody. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Is Representative Sherrill available? Give one more time. Representative Sherrill. Okay, thank you. If there are no more questions, we're going to adjourn for 15 minutes and move up. And we have one question. Yes, Representative Larson.
Yeah, this won't be long, but for Mr. Mayor again, or anyone else. Sorry. Good? Okay. So within SOCOM, they have the MISO capability, the responsibility, and that's supposed to be web-based, but there's a lot of non-web-based information operations that occur. So when we hear from you about SOCOM's responsibility, is it limited to web-based information operations, or are you how are you sharing across this intelligence domain the totality of information operations? And then could you help me understand what you all mean by information domain as well? So it's a real short question, but like everything else, it's always the answer that's long.
Congressman Larson, yes, sir. So maybe if it's okay, I'll take the last question first and then speak to the SOCOM context. So I think not to recite doctrine for information operations, but what we really mean by that is those operations that are in that operational sphere, informed by the strategic, informed by the tactical, but really that connection between. So if there's strategic guidance and we're implementing a strategic approach, the information component of that is really bringing that strategy down to tactical execution. That can be public affairs, that can be military information support operations, that can be a host of other things. And it's really the discipline as we would look at it doctrinally. What I think this hearing has elicited is it takes on a lot of different forms, and I think there's a defensive and offensive component to it. As we think of it, from the Department of Defense, we think of it in both contexts. On your question of Special Operations Command and MISO, they are the proponent, as we use the term, for military information support operations, by citing the Joint MISO Web Ops Center was the entity that they built there to operate in the free-flowing nature of cyberspace for MISO. But SOCOM is supporting the Global Combatant Commands, and the Global Combatant Commands are the ones actually executing MISO operations in the far fletches of the world that we're operating in. So done so in conjunction with the chief's submission approval in the country teams in the particular countries they're operating. Does that answer your question? Or
maybe we can get into it a little more in the classified. It might help me understand with some examples on that. Mr. Sullivan, early on you said Russia sees the information domain differently than the U.S. sees information domain. Is there an answer you can give us about what those differences are in this setting?
Yeah, Mr. Larson, so by and large, Russia brings really the full spectrum. Russia does not differentiate information confrontation and disinformation the way we do. They look at it much more holistically than we do. They look at it through the electromagnetic spectrum. They look through active measures. They incorporate it into all aspects of cyber warfare, to include intelligence collection and the like. We tend to kind of parse it out a little bit here, as we're doing in this hearing right now, talking specifically about disinformation. If this was going on in Russia right now, the conversation would probably be a little bit more overarching and incorporate a lot more of traditional, what we would call old FSB tactics as well. So we kind of parse it a bit, but they look at it much more holistically than we do.
So not so much better or worse, but it's kind of based on how they've done it in the past, whereas we have important limitations in place based in a written constitution, as a for instance, that say we can do certain things and we cannot absolutely do other things.
Well, I'll say
that's
this.
One example.
Sure, I'll say this. In the United States, okay, we are not going to, fabricate or alter data and release it publicly. The Russians would have no problem doing that, and do that quite often.
Yeah, sure. That's an example. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. If there are no other questions, we're going to adjourn for 15 minutes and move to our classified briefing. In Rayburn 2212. Thank you.